He sat alone at the edge of the celebration, surrounded by laughter he was not invited to share. Nobody looked his way. Nobody called his name. And when the food finally came to him, it was not served on the fine ceramic plates that lined every other table. It came in a black plastic bowl, scraped from the bottoms of pots. Cold vegetables. Dry, forgotten pieces of meat that nobody else wanted. The kind of meal you would not offer a guest. The kind of meal you would not offer a stranger. But this was not a stranger. This was Pa Chukwudi Okafor, 72 years old. Father. Grandfather. The man whose blood ran through the veins of every person dancing in that compound tonight. And nobody flinched. Nobody looked twice. He picked up his spoon quietly, bowed his head, and began to eat. Then a black SUV rolled through the gates. A man in a sharp suit stepped out. He scanned every table, every face, every corner of that glittering compound. And then he asked one question that silenced every conversation, every laugh, every clink of a glass. Where is Pa Chukwudi Okafor? The old man, eating leftovers, slowly raised his hand. And the truth that had been buried for 40 years began to surface. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if you are new here, click the subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Stories like this one come every week, and you do not want to miss what is coming next. Now let us go back to the beginning. Because a story like this does not start at a party. It starts long before the lights are strung up and the jollof rice is set to boil. It starts in a small mechanic workshop in a dusty town, decades ago, where a young man named Chukwudi Okafor decided that his children would have a better life than he ever had, even if it cost him everything he owned. Chukwudi was not born into wealth. He was born into determination. His father had been a farmer. His mother had sold firewood to pay school fees. By the time Chukwudi was old enough to understand what poverty felt like from the inside, he had already made a vow to himself. A quiet vow, the kind a man makes at midnight when no one is listening. He would give his children the world, even if the world never gave him anything back. He trained as a mechanic. His hands knew the inside of an engine the way a musician knows the keys of his instrument. He could hear a fault in a car's timing before the driver could feel it. He was good, not just adequate. He was genuinely gifted, and he used that gift to build something small but steady. A workshop, 3 employees, a modest income, enough to rent a good house in a decent part of town, enough to keep his children in good schools, enough to make his wife Ifeoma smile. Ifeoma. If Chukwudi was the foundation of the family, Ifeoma was the warmth that made it a home. She was not a loud woman, not the kind of woman who filled a room with her voice. She filled rooms with her presence. The way she cooked, the way she laughed at Chukwudi's terrible jokes even when they were not funny, the way she combed young Emeka's hair on Sunday mornings before church. She was the reason Chukwudi woke up every morning and chose to keep going, even on the days when the money ran out before the month did. They had 3 children together. Emeka, the firstborn, Ada, the daughter, and Tabena, the quiet one. Chukwudi poured himself into each of them differently, the way a man waters different plants in a garden, knowing each one needs something slightly different to grow. Emeka was the most ambitious. From childhood, he had that restless energy, always looking forward, always calculating, always watching the men who drove the big cars and deciding that one day he would be among them. Chukwudi saw this. He did not discourage it. He channeled it. Every school fee Emeka ever paid came from a sacrifice Chukwudi never talked about. A celebration skipped. A new pair of shoes not bought. A machine part paid for with borrowed money so that the workshop could survive another month. When Emeka gained admission to the university, it was one of the greatest days of Chukwudi's life. He sat outside the family house that evening and wept quietly while Ifeoma held his hand. Not because he was sad, because he had done it. His son was going to the university. His son would become something. To pay that first year's fees and hostel costs, Chukwudi sold a piece of ancestral land. It was not his to sell sentimentally. It had belonged to his grandfather. It was the last physical connection to where his family had come from. He held the documents for one full night before he signed them over. Then he handed the money to Emeka, looked his son in the eye, and said, "Make it count." Emeka hugged him and promised he would. Those were different times. Years passed. Ada fell seriously ill and needed surgery. Chukwudi took a second job, working nights. He came home exhausted, smelling of industrial oil and sweat, and yet he still sat at the table every morning and asked how the children were doing. He never missed a school meeting, never failed to bring home small gifts on Christmas. He was present, even when he was tired, especially when he was tired. Then Ifeoma got sick. It started small, a cough that would not go away, fatigue that no amount of rest seemed to cure. Then the diagnosis came, and with it, a weight that Chukwudi carried alone for the first several months because he did not want his children to panic during their exams. He sold the mechanic workshop to pay for her treatment. He spent every naira he had. He borrowed what he did not have. He prayed in ways he had never prayed before, not the formal church prayers but the desperate, bargaining, middle-of-the-night prayers where a man offers everything and asks for just one thing in return. Ifeoma fought for 3 years. She was brave until she wasn't. Then she was gone. After the burial, something in Chukwudi changed. Not broke. Changed. There is a difference. A broken man collapses inward and takes everything around him down with him. But Chukwudi simply became quieter, more careful with his words. He still helped. He still showed up. But it was as if, with Ifeoma gone, he had decided to live for others completely. As if his own life and his own comfort had become secondary to the lives of the people he had built. Nobody noticed this shift, because nobody was watching him closely enough. Not even his children. One rainy night, not long after Ifeoma's funeral, Chukwudi sat alone in his small house and gathered certain documents together. Old papers. Records nobody had ever asked to see. He placed them carefully inside a worn metal box, the kind with a simple latch and a rusted hinge, the kind that looks completely worthless from the outside. He wrapped the box in a piece of his wife's old cloth. Then he went to the corner of his bedroom, lifted 2 floorboards that had already been loosened over years of planning, and placed the box in the hollow beneath. He pressed the boards back into place and stood up slowly. He said nothing. There was nobody to say anything to. He turned off the light and went to bed. And for the next 20 years, nobody touched those floorboards. Time moved. The children grew into adults. Emeka built a business empire that the whole town talked about. He had offices. He had staff. He had a house with a generator powerful enough to light a small street. He drove expensive cars and wore the kind of shoes that were chosen deliberately, not just worn. He married Ngozi, a woman from a good family, sharp and beautiful and completely consumed by the idea of how things looked to other people. Ngozi was not a cruel woman. She was a fearful woman, afraid of being poor again, afraid of being looked down upon, afraid of losing the status she had spent her entire life constructing. And this fear, when it was applied to a man like Chukwudi, who wore old sandals and threadbare clothes and spoke only when necessary, became something that looked very much like contempt. "Emeka," she said one evening, 2 years after Chukwudi had moved in with them, "your father sat in the sitting room today when the Adichie family visited." "So," Emeka said without looking up from his phone. "So they asked who he was. What did you say?" "I said he was an elderly relative." There was a pause. "Good," Emeka said. And that was that. From that point forward, Pa Chukwudi Okafor was not introduced as the father of the house. He was introduced as an elderly relative, sometimes not introduced at all. When guests came, someone would quietly go to Chukwudi and say, "Papa, please, just stay in your room until they leave." At first, Chukwudi complied without protest. He understood that his son was an important man. He understood the social pressures of living at a certain level. He did not want to be a source of embarrassment. But months became years, and the distance grew. He was moved out of the comfortable guest room and into a small space that had been used for storage. He was not included in family decisions, not told when major things happened in the business, not consulted even on things that involved his own grandchildren. At the dinner table, conversation flowed around him like water around a stone. People spoke over him, sometimes directly through him as if he were not present. The humiliation was never dramatic. It was the quiet, grinding kind. The kind that does not leave visible marks, but builds inside a person until they become someone slightly different from who they once were. Chukwidi's posture, once that of a man who walked with purpose, began to fold. His eyes, once warm and direct, learned to stay low. He stopped offering opinions, stopped sharing stories. He became, in that household, invisible. Only one person in the house saw him. Amara. Emeka Ngozi's daughter was 17 years old and possessed of a quality that cannot be taught and cannot be faked. She saw people. Not what they wore or how they talked or what status they occupied in the world's endless rankings. She saw people, and what she saw in her grandfather was not a burden. What she saw was a man who had lived with extraordinary quiet dignity and had never once complained about the cost. She brought him tea in the mornings when no one was watching. She sat with him in the evenings and asked him to tell her stories from when Emeka was a boy. She laughed at the stories, genuinely, not to make him feel good, but because the stories were actually funny, and her laughter made Chukwudi's eyes come alive in a way nothing else seemed to. "Grandpa," she said to him one evening, sitting beside him in the small room they had given him, "do you ever get angry?" Chukwudi was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Anger is a fire, my child. You can warm yourself by it, or you can burn your house down. I have only one house left." Amara looked at him for a long moment. "That is the wisest thing I have ever heard," she said. He smiled. "Don't tell your father. He will try to patent it." She laughed so hard that Ngozi knocked on the wall from the next room and told them to keep the noise down. The night of the anniversary party arrived like every important night in Emeka's household arrived, with maximum production value and minimum soul. The canopies were rented. The caterers were hired. The generator hummed with the confidence of a man who had never known what darkness felt like. Guests arrived in cars that matched the compound's ambitions, and the laughter that filled the evening was the kind of laughter that is meant to be heard. Chukwudi sat in the corner. He had dressed carefully, which was to say he had worn the best of the few things he owned. His trousers were old but clean. His shirt was ironed with the iron Amara had quietly set up for him that afternoon. He had combed his white hair and polished his worn shoes. He walked to the celebration with the quiet certainty of a man who has earned his seat at every table, even if no one agrees. Nobody saved him a seat. He found a plastic chair at the edge of the compound, near the fence, where the light from the decorations did not quite reach. For an hour he sat and watched. He watched his son move through the crowd with the easy grace of a man in his element. He watched Ngozi laugh at things that were not funny because the person saying them was worth laughing for. He watched young men and women eat from generous plates and drink from tall glasses and celebrate his son's success, which was, though no one here would ever know it, partly his success too. Then a server came to him, not one of the main caterers, one of the junior helpers, a young boy who had been given the task nobody else wanted. The boy carried a plastic bowl, not a plate. Inside it were the remnants of the serving process, cold vegetables that had dried at the edges, 2 pieces of meat that had fallen from someone's plate and been collected with the scraps. Half-eaten things. "Sir," the boy said, holding the bowl out without making eye contact. The guests nearby glanced over. A woman in a lime green asoebi stifled a laugh. A man whispered something to his wife. Someone else looked away, the particular looking away of a person who finds discomfort easier to avoid than to address. Chukwudi looked at the bowl for a moment. Then he looked at the boy, who was clearly mortified by his own errand. "Thank you, my son," Chukwudi said gently. He took the bowl. He placed it on his lap. He bowed his head briefly, in the habit of a man who thanks God before eating regardless of what the meal looks like. Then he picked up the plastic spoon the boy had included and began to eat. The laughter around the compound continued. The music rose. Someone made a toast to Emeka, and the crowd cheered. Chukwudi chewed his cold food quietly and watched his family celebrate. And then the gate opened. The black SUV did not honk. It simply glided in, slow and deliberate, the kind of arrival that does not ask permission. A driver stepped out first, then a man in his 60s, wearing a charcoal suit that fit him the way suits only fit men who have worn many of them. He carried a thick brown envelope under one arm. He wore glasses and moved with the unhurried certainty of someone who had important information and knew that time was on his side. Barrister Obinna Nwosu. He stood at the edge of the gathering and let his eyes move across the crowd. He passed over the dancing. He passed over the important-looking guests. He passed over Emeka, who had stopped laughing and was now watching this stranger from across the compound with a slight crease between his brows. Then the barrister scanned the edges of the gathering, the corners, the spaces where the light grew thin. He found the old man. He walked toward him, slowly, deliberately, and when he was close enough for his voice to carry across the now quieting compound, he stopped and asked his question. "Where is Pa Chukwudi Okafor?" The music died. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. A woman with a glass halfway to her lips froze. The old man, eating leftovers, slowly raised his hand. The barrister's expression did not change, but something moved through his eyes. Something that might have been respect, or recognition, or the particular feeling of a man arriving exactly where he was supposed to be. "Sir," Barrister Nwosu said, "we have been searching for you." Emeka moved through the crowd, pushing past confused guests, his face shifting through 3 different expressions in as many seconds. Ngozi appeared beside him, her eyes darting from the barrister to the old man to the envelope. "Can I help you?" Emeka said to the barrister, positioning himself the way men position themselves when they are not sure if they are protecting something or afraid of something. The barrister did not look at Emeka. He was still looking at Chikwudi. "I need to speak with Pa Chikwudi privately," he said, "on a matter of considerable legal and financial importance." Ngozi said, "He is just an elderly." "He is the reason I am here," the barrister said, and something in his voice made her stop speaking. Chikwudi set down his bowl slowly. He looked at the barrister and said, quietly, "I have been expecting someone. I did not know it would be you, or tonight, but I have been expecting someone." The barrister nodded once. "Then let us talk," he said. "If you are still watching up to now, type, 'I'm still here,' in the comment section. Because what is about to be revealed will change how you see every quiet person you have ever overlooked." They sat together inside the house, in the formal sitting room that Emeka and Ngozi reserved for important guests. The irony was not lost on anyone who was paying attention. Chikwudi, who had been kept out of this room for gatherings far less significant than this one, now occupied its center chair with a calm that seemed to confuse and unsettle everyone watching. Emeka sat across from them. Ngozi stood near the door, arms folded. Amara had followed quietly and sat in the corner, her eyes wide and still. The barrister opened the envelope. "Pa Chikwudi," he began, "I represent the estate of the late Chief Solomon Ease of Nui, who passed away 4 months ago. In the course of settling his estate, our firm conducted a thorough review of all outstanding financial obligations and equity arrangements going back several decades. During that review, we discovered a name." He paused and looked directly at Chikwudi. "Your name?" Emeka leaned forward. "What kind of arrangement?" "Approximately 38 years ago," the barrister continued, ignoring Emeka completely, "your father provided critical financial assistance to what was then a struggling transport and trading company owned by Chief Solomon Ease. That company was on the edge of collapse. The assistance came at a time when no bank would lend to it and no investor would touch it." Chikwudi was quiet. He was listening, but there was something in his expression that suggested he already knew most of what was being said. "In exchange for that assistance," the barrister said, "your father received something. Not cash. He was offered a cash payment, but he declined. He accepted instead a shareholding in the company. A small one. At the time, by any reasonable assessment, those shares were worth almost nothing. The company was nearly bankrupt. Most people would have taken the cash." Ngozi made a small sound, something between a question and a laugh. "Your father did not take the cash," the barrister said. "Papa," Emeka said slowly, turning to Chikwudi, "what company?" "Continue," Chikwudi said to the barrister, as if his son had not spoken. "The company survived. Over the following decade it grew. Then it grew rapidly. It expanded into logistics, construction materials, and eventually into real estate. Today it is among the top 30 privately held companies in this country by asset value." The barrister reached into the envelope and produced a document. "The shares your father received and never sold, never transferred, never did anything at all with, have accumulated and appreciated in value over nearly 4 decades. With the dividends that were never claimed rolled back into additional equity, the current valuation of your father's stake in the Ease Group of companies is approximately 470 million naira." The room did not react immediately. It was the kind of number that requires a moment for the brain to process, a moment for the ears to confirm what they heard, a moment for the body to catch up with what the mind is beginning to understand. Then Ngozi sat down heavily on the nearest chair. Emeka's mouth opened and then closed. Amara, in the corner, pressed both hands over her mouth. Chikwudi folded his hands in his lap and said nothing. "There is a complication," the barrister said. "To transfer the shares and release the accumulated equity, we need certain documentation. Specifically, the original equity agreement signed between your father and Chief Ease. Without it, The transfer will face legal challenges from other parties contesting the estate. We have copies of secondary records, but the primary document, the one signed by your father, has not been located. He looked at Chukwudi. Do you know where the original agreement might be? And here is where Pa Chukwudi Okafor did something that nobody in that room was prepared for. He smiled. It was not a triumphant smile. Not the smile of a man who had been waiting to be proven right. It was the smile of a man who had kept a very long patience and had arrived at the moment where patience becomes something else. Yes, he said simply. Papa, Emeka said, and his voice cracked on the second syllable in a way that revealed everything he had spent years hiding. Do you know what this means? Chukwudi looked at his son for a long moment. I know exactly what it means, he said. Then he stood up slowly, with the careful movement of a man whose joints carry the history of hard work, and said, I am going to need to make a journey. What followed was not a quiet private search. The moment word spread through the guests still waiting outside that there were documents involved in something worth hundreds of millions of naira, every person in that compound underwent a transformation that was simultaneously predictable and deeply painful to watch. The same relatives who had not visited in 3 years suddenly needed to know if there was anything they could do. The neighbors who had treated Chukwudi's presence as an embarrassment now offered him food, good food, from the main pots, not from the plastic bowl at the edge of things. Emeka walked beside his father with his hand on the old man's back, calling him Papa in a voice that carried across the compound, as if he needed everyone to hear it now that it mattered, now that it cost him nothing to claim the relationship. Chukwudi noticed all of it. He said nothing. He walked calmly through the shifting attention with the same composure he had worn while eating leftovers 20 minutes earlier. But it was Amara who moved to his side without being asked. It was Amara who took his hand and walked with him out through the compound gate toward the car that would take them to his old house. The house where the floorboards had been waiting for 20 years. In the car, the barrister sat in the front. Emeka and Ngozi insisted on coming. Amara sat beside her grandfather, her hand still in his. Grandpa, she said quietly, so the others could not hear. Were you ever going to tell us? Tell you what, he said. About the shares. About any of it. He considered this for a moment. Outside the window, the town moved past in fragments of streetlight and shadow. I would have told the person who needed to know, he said. I was waiting to find out who that person was. Amara looked down at their joined hands. And, she said. And, he said, I think I already know. The old house was smaller than memory had made it. Paint peeling in long strips from the exterior walls. The veranda where Ifeoma used to shell groundnuts in the evenings was now occupied by a cracked plastic chair and an overgrown pot plant that had surrendered to its own wildness. But the door still had the same lock, and the key still worked. Chukwudi walked in first. The others followed. Emeka looked around the house with an expression that moved between discomfort and something harder to name. This was the house he had grown up in. This was the house his mother had filled with smells of food and the sound of her voice. He had not been inside it in 11 years. He had paid the property tax from a distance and told himself that was enough. Chukwudi went directly to the bedroom. He moved aside the small bed. He crouched down slowly, his knees complaining in the way old knees do, and he pressed his fingers along the floorboards until he found the seam. He pulled. The 2 boards came up with a sound like a slow exhale. The metal box was there. Ngozi made a sound. Emeka moved forward. Amara stood perfectly still. Chukwudi lifted the box. He carried it to the bed and sat. He unlatched it with hands that did not shake, though everyone expected them to. Inside, wrapped in a piece of Ifeoma's wrapper, were the documents. The equity agreement, on paper that had yellowed slightly at the edges but remained legible. Signed. Dated. Witnessed. But there was more. Beneath the agreement were other papers. More documents. A notebook. A series of receipts. The barrister leaned forward and began to examine the equity agreement. He confirmed the signatures. He confirmed the dates. He looked up and nodded once. This is what we need. But Chukwudi was looking at the other papers. The notebook. Emeka was looking at them too. He picked up the receipts slowly, the way you pick something up when you are not entirely sure you want to know what it is. He read. His face changed. He read further. His face changed again, more dramatically this time. Papa, Emeka said, and this time the word was barely a word at all. It was barely sound. It was the collapse of 11 years of pride into a single syllable. Papa, what is this? Chikwudi said. You know what it is. Is this? Emeka stopped. He pressed his lips together. He looked at the ceiling for a moment before he could look at his father again. Is this the investment that kept my company alive? 12 years ago, when the contractor pulled out and I needed emergency capital? Chikwudi said nothing. I thought it was a bank, Emeka said. The solicitor said it was an anonymous private investment. He said the investor wanted no credit, no equity, no repayment terms. He stopped again. His voice was becoming unreliable. I spent years wondering who did that. I thank God for it. I built everything I have on top of that moment. He held up the papers. It was you. Chikwudi looked at his son. Your mother had just died. You were struggling. What was I supposed to do? You had nothing. You had already sold the land. You had spent everything on Mama's treatment. Where did you? Emeka could not finish the sentence because his voice broke completely. I sold the house, Chikwudi said simply. This house. I sold it and rented it back. For 7 years I paid rent on a house I had already sold. Then when I had saved enough, I bought it back. The notebook shows the calculations. The room was absolutely still. Emeka looked at the notebook in his hands. Then he looked at his father. Then he looked at the floor, the way a man looks at the floor when he is trying to hold himself together and failing. Ngozi had not moved. She was standing in the corner of the room where Ifeoma had kept her Bible and her prayer beads, and the color had left her face entirely. Because she was doing the arithmetic. The arithmetic that a woman who has spent 15 years measuring people by their bank accounts cannot help but do. The man she had moved into the storage room. The man she had given the plastic bowl. The man she had told their guests was just an elderly relative. That man had sold his own house to save her husband's business. That man had worked and sacrificed and stayed silent for decades while she dressed in expensive fabric and served him cold leftovers at a party he built the foundation for. She sat down on the floor. Not in a chair. On the floor. Her legs simply declined to hold her anymore. Nobody spoke for what felt like a very long time. Outside, somewhere distant, a dog barked. A car passed on the road beyond the gate. Life continued in its ordinary way, unaware that something in this small room had shifted permanently. Then Amara spoke. She had been standing near the doorway, watching everything, and when she spoke her voice was steadier than anyone else's in the room. Grandpa, she said, why? Why did you never tell anyone? Why did you never ask for anything? Chikwudi looked at his granddaughter for a long moment, and when he answered her the way he always answered her, as though she were the one person in every room worth speaking honestly to. When you love someone, he said, you do not keep receipts. The moment you hold a sacrifice over a person's head, it is no longer a sacrifice. It becomes a weapon. I did not want weapons. I wanted my children to be safe. I wanted my son's business to survive. I wanted. He paused and his voice, the most controlled voice in the room, finally wavered. Just briefly. Just enough. I wanted your grandmother to be proud of the family she left behind. That is all I ever wanted. Emeka made a sound that was not quite a word. He crossed the room in 3 steps, and he went down to his knees in front of his father. Not kneeling the way people kneel in church. Collapsing the way people collapse when they have been carrying something too heavy for too long and finally, someone takes it from them. Papa, forgive me, he said. The words came out ragged and honest in a way that 12 years of business success had probably not heard from him. Forgive me. I am sorry. I am so sorry. I did not see you. I did not see what you were. I was ashamed of. He stopped. He could not say the next part out loud. He did not need to. Chikwudi put his hand on his son's head, the way he had done when Emeka was small, the way a man does when the gesture is older than any argument and more powerful than any amount of money. Get up, he said gently. You are embarrassing yourself in front of the barrister. Emeka made a sound that was halfway between a sob and a laugh. Amara was crying in the corner, making no effort to hide it. Even Barrister Nwosu, who had attended hundreds of estate hearings and had long since developed a professional distance from the emotions in the rooms he entered, was looking carefully at the papers in his hands with more attention than they strictly required. Ngozi rose from the floor. She straightened her expensive aso-ebi wrapper. She walked across the room with the careful steps of a woman who knows she has no adequate words and is trying to find them anyway. She stopped in front of Chikwudi and she looked at him. Properly. Maybe for the first time. I owe you an apology, she said. The words came out smaller than she was. More honest than she usually allowed herself to be. Not just for tonight. For everything. For all of it. Chikwudi studied her face. Ngozi, he said finally, you were afraid. People who are afraid do unkind things. I do not hate you for it. I only ask that from now, you choose differently. She nodded. She pressed her lips together. She could not speak. Good, Chikwudi said. Then he looked at the barrister. What happens next? What happened next took 3 months of legal processing and document verification. But the outcome was never seriously in doubt. The equity agreement was authentic, the witnesses traceable, the chain of ownership unbroken. 470 million naira in shares and accumulated equity were transferred formally into the name of Pa Chikwudi Okafor. News of the settlement moved through certain circles in the way significant financial news moves, quietly, and then all at once. The same relatives who had called him an embarrassment called to congratulate him. Neighbors who had never acknowledged his existence sent representatives with bottles of wine. A local government official he had never met requested a courtesy visit. Chikwudi received all of it with the same quiet equanimity he had carried through the harder years, which is to say he received it politely and gave it no more weight than it deserved. He declined to move back into Emeka's house. He accepted, instead, his son's help in finding a modest but dignified property nearby. Not a mansion. Chikwudi had no interest in mansions. He wanted a place with a good veranda, the kind where you could sit in the morning with your tea and watch the day begin without the day demanding anything from you. He wanted a garden, because Ifeoma had always wanted a garden. He planted it in her memory. He established a scholarship fund, naming it after her. The Ifeoma Okafor Foundation, for young women in secondary school who showed academic promise but lacked financial support. He endowed it with enough that it would run independently for 20 years without requiring any further fundraising. He sat at the signing ceremony and thought about the woman who had sold her personal jewelry during the difficult years so that Ada could have her school uniforms. He made one other financial arrangement, privately, through Barrister Nwosu, that nobody knew about until it was done. Amara's education. All of it. Every year of university, every postgraduate degree she chose to pursue, every professional development course, every opportunity. Fully funded, in an account in her name. Accessible the day she was ready to begin. When Amara found out, she went to find her grandfather on the veranda of his new home. She sat beside him, and for a while neither of them said anything. The garden was young and scraggly, the way new gardens are, full of potential and not yet sure of itself. You did not have to do that, she said finally. No, he agreed. Then why? Because when I was eating from that plastic bowl, he said, you were the only person in that compound who looked at me and saw a person. Not a burden. Not an embarrassment. A person. Do you know how rare that is, Amara? To simply be seen. She said nothing. Everything else I did, he continued, I did for my children, because they needed it. What I did for you, I did because you earned it. There is a difference. Amara leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. The garden continued being a garden in its imperfect, growing way. The anniversary party that began everything was never mentioned directly in polite family conversation again. But it was never forgotten either. It lived in the family the way formative events live, not as a wound exactly, but as a scar that reminds you of something every time you catch the light at the right angle. Emeka changed. Not overnight. Not completely. Men like Emeka do not transform in the clean, sudden way that stories sometimes suggest. But he changed in the ways that matter. He began calling his father every morning, brief calls, just to check in. He visited on weekends and sat with Chikwudi on the veranda and drank tea and talked about things that had nothing to do with business. He began introducing his father to people the way a man introduces someone he is proud of, looking them in the eye, saying the name clearly. Saying, this is my father. He told his own story, once, at a business conference, about the anonymous investor who had saved his company, not knowing then who it was, and what it had meant to him. He did not say who the investor was. He said only that the person had asked for nothing in return and that he hoped, wherever they were, they knew the gift had not been wasted. He thought his father did not know about the speech. He was wrong. Amara told him. Chikwudi listened to the summary and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, he always was a good speaker, that boy. The world has a habit of measuring people by the obvious things. The car they drive, the fabric they wear, the table they sit at, and the fullness of the plate in front of them. It is an efficient system Because it requires no effort. You look, you classify, you move on. What the system cannot account for is depth. What the system cannot account for is a man who sold his own house to protect someone who did not know they were being protected. It cannot account for 40 years of quiet sacrifice, 40 years of carrying a story without asking anyone to carry it with him. Pachakwudi Okafor was the wealthiest person in that compound the night he ate from the plastic bowl. He was the wealthiest person there not because of the shares or the equity or the 470 million naira waiting in a lawyer's office. He was the wealthiest person there because of what he had given without asking for credit, what he had carried without expecting relief, what he had loved without condition or receipt. He was the wealthiest person there because of the kind of man he chose to be when no one was watching. And sometimes, in the best possible version of things, the truth arrives exactly when people need it most. It arrives in a black SUV with a brown envelope and a lawyer who has been looking. It arrives at a party where someone has been given the wrong kind of plate. It arrives in front of everyone, in the full glare of celebration lights, and it does not apologize for being late. It simply says, "We have been searching for you." And the man who was always there slowly raises his hand. The final lesson is not really about money. Money was the mechanism, the proof, the visible evidence of something invisible. The final lesson is this. The person eating the leftovers might be carrying the whole table on their back. The person you walk past, the one who is quiet, the one who wears old shoes and takes up less room than you think they deserve, that person might be the reason the lights are on, might be the reason the business survived, might be the reason you had the opportunity to become the person who now looks right past them. See people, not their clothes, not their status, not what season of life they appear to be in. See them, because you do not know what they have carried for you. And because on the day the truth comes out, you want to be the one who is paying attention, not the one scrambling to remember their name. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone you know or someone you need to see more clearly, please like this video and share it with the people in your life who need to hear it. Subscribe to our channel so you do not miss the stories we release every week. Stories about dignity, sacrifice, truth, and the extraordinary lives of ordinary people. Leave a comment and tell us what moment in this video stayed with you the most. We read every single one. Because the people who watch until the end, who stay with the story from the first line to the last, those are the people who still believe that truth matters. That patience has a place. That kindness is never wasted. We will see you in the next one.